Hello and welcome to the second of the Caister Talks. In the first talk, we heard Sally Ann Lomas talk a bit about the Norwich that Richard Caister would have known. In this talk, local historian Frank Mears is going to take us through some of the documents and some of the sources through which we know about Richard Caister, who he was, and the sort of life that he lived. Frank Mears is a local historian who has a publication list about as long as my arm, maybe even longer. He's been involved in the Richard Caister project right from the beginning. And most of what we know about Richard Caister, is in our particular project, has come from Frank. He has written a booklet on Richard Caister, which you can pick up from St Stephen's Church and from the Castle Museum once they reopen. And he's also written a number of other books, including a book on the suffragettes and also another book entitled The Story of Norwich. We're delighted to have him here with us this evening. Obviously, we're having to conduct these talks in a slightly different way, now recorded via Zoom and then broadcast through YouTube. But we're delighted that he's going to be giving this talk this evening, and also delighted that you are watching it. So throughout the talk, Frank has a few images which I haven't quite worked out how to put up alongside him speaking. So there's going to be a little bit of disruption as I put those images up, but that should be just fine. So Frank, over to you.
Hello, and thanks for listening. What I'm going to talk about is really the nuts and bolts of the life of Richard Caister. What do we actually know about him? How do we know? I'm from an archive background, so I'll be thinking about the documents which mention him both in his lifetime and afterwards. Bearing in mind that he died in 1420, so we're talking early 15th century, late 14th century, the number of documents actually mentioning Richard Caister and written in his lifetime would be somewhere between 6 and 8, that's all. And there's nothing unusual about that. In fact, that is probably more than you might expect for a man of his status at that time, because a couple of the documents are absolutely amazing. The most fantastic one we're privileged to have is the reminiscences of Margery Kempe. Margery Kempe being the King's Lynn mystic, great pilgrim, went as far as Jerusalem and Rome. And she was a great friend of Richard's and mentions him quite a lot in her autobiography, where she set down her reminiscences. Really, it's a bit formal to call it an autobiography, but in about 20 years after she'd been on these amazing trips, and she is a great friend of Richard's. So that's an amazing resource, and another amazing resource which the Record Office has is his actual will. So there you're getting his own words, in his own words, what he thinks is important at the end of his life. So 6 to 8 documents contemporary to him, another 6 to 8, and this is rather extraordinary, talking about what happened after he died and how his tomb becomes a place of pilgrimage. We'll come back to those documents. So that's it, about a dozen documents altogether. And there's also, the sources are early printed books, some of which the authors will or may have had access to material we no longer own, no longer survives. The prime one of these is John Bale, who's not writing till 1549. That's 130 years after Richard Caister has died. But he has information in his book, which is not known in any archive source now, but presumably he had the documentary material to hand. Bale is especially interesting because he's actually brought up in Norwich. He was actually a Carmelite friar, so he may have had knowledge from people actually in the city, as well as documentary evidence. Second historian to mention Richard Caister is Holinshed. Now, he doesn't add anything new. He's obviously just copying down Bale, as people used to. In the days when people didn't fuss about copyright, he just cut down a shorter version of Bale. But Holinshed is interesting because it gives a nice link to the culture of the time, because Holinshed is what Shakespeare used to writing his histories. So assuming that Shakespeare read the whole of Holinshed and didn't cherry pick, he will have come across these few lines about Richard Caister. So it's nice to think Shakespeare had heard of Richard Caister, even though, alas, he didn't feel appropriate to put him into any of his plays. But another historian who comes slightly later, half a century after Bale, is Pitts, Lawrence Pitts. and he is uncertain whether he knew anything that Bale didn't, or whether he was just making up extra bits. But he's interesting because he approaches it from a rather different angle, because he's a Roman Catholic. He's a Roman Catholic historian, whereas John Bale is a Protestant historian, despite being brought up as a friar. And then really you leap 200 years and you come to Bloomfield. Bloomfield is very great for anyone who's interested in the history of Norfolk, of Norwich. Bloomfield is very great, a master historian writing in the 1740s, and he has quite a lot to say about Richard Caister. Did he have any extra information? We know that he read bits, and he definitely read Bale, because he quotes them extensively. He also has other bits of information. Where does he get those from? And are they accurate? We'll come back to that in a second. So these are the documents. Of course, the one document I haven't mentioned is his prayer, which of course is going to be discussed in detail in a later talk. And there are about 24 copies of that in manuscript form, showing it was a very popular prayer at the time. And people wrote it out by hand and put it into their books of devotion. But of course, those don't say anything about his actual personal life, his biography. So I'm not going to talk much about his prayer. Coming back to the basics, starting at the beginning, we can't really start at the beginning because we know nothing of Richard's early life. We have no idea who his father and mother were, for example, or whether they were rich or poor. The assumption is, from his name, that he was born in Caister. And this is how names worked. I think we'd be pretty sure about that. If you look at his own will, you see that his executors are called John Barsham, Henry Brisley. They're both priests. So they have the Christian name, if you like, plus the place from where they came. And you think of other figures, monks in Norwich Cathedral, Thomas Brinton, for example, who rises to become Bishop of Norwich, Bishop of Rochester, I say Bishop of Rochester. And of course, the most famous of all, Adam Easton, coming from that village just outside Norwich, rising to become ultimately a cardinal in Rome, and dying in Rome. You can go, when you are able to travel, you can go to Rome and see his tomb, on which is written Cardinal Adam Easton. So that's how the names are working, so that's why we're pretty sure. But Richard Caister was born at Caister, which raises the question, of course, because there are two Caisters in Norfolk. Richard was very probably born at Caister St Edmund, just south of Norwich. Slide number 1, please, Alex. In this church here, so this is Caister St Edmund, just 2 miles south of Norwich. There is an alternative, which is Caister Holy Trinity, which is just outside Yarmouth. It's now more commonly called Caister next Yarmouth. But if you look at records of people who came from there, they do tend to call themselves Frederick of Caister Holy Trinity. I think just for Caister does suggest Caister St Edmunds. And certainly Bale, writing, as we say, a century and more afterwards, was quite sure that Richard was born at Caister St Edmunds. Bloomfield follows him, says he's definitely born at Caister St Edmunds, Caister just south of Norwich. He adduces an extra proof, or he thinks he does, because he says that right in his time, 1745, there is a font in the church which he had seen, which has the word Castra on it. And if you read a whole inscription, it says that this font was a gift to the church of Caister St Edmund by Richard Caister the priest. And funnily enough, that is repeated even in the modern day in Pevsner, which is Pevsner's Buildings of England. If you read what he says about Caister St Edmund, he says the font was a gift of Richard Caister. So he's presumably basing that on the evidence of Bloomfield. Bloomfield is basing it on this evidence of this inscription, and this inscription doesn't say anything like that at all. So unfortunately, the whole thing is a false trail of the inscription, which is now, to be fair to Bloomfield, is now much cleaner than it would have been in his day. And it refers to, it has the word Caister in it, Castra, but is talking about a guild, some local guild in Caister, which presumably paid for the font. So you've always got to go back and trace these things back step by step to the original archive evidence, if you can. So we can't be absolutely sure that he was born in Caister St Edmund, but we'd be pretty sure. And of course, what we would like to know, as I say, is his status, rich or poor. We'd like to know where he was schooled, but we have no information whatsoever. And this is due just to the lack of documents. He could, for example, have been brought up and taught by the local vicar in Caister. He could have had a formal schooling. There were plenty of schools in Norwich. Cathedral Priory would have had a school. The 4 friaries in Norwich would all have had a school. And it's perfectly possible that he was highly educated as he went to university at Cambridge or Oxford, the only 2 universities current at the time. We just don't know that because their admission registers don't survive. There are a couple of little points that suggest he was a graduate, but at least one document which suggests he probably wasn't. So we don't know. In fact, he first comes to light. The first time you actually have a document mentioning Richard Caister is a document dated 1385. And this is a register of Merton Priory, the Suffolk monastic house. And Richard is mentioned in there as having had his first tonsure, he's had his hair cut, prior to becoming a priest. And he is now about to be ordained in Norwich Diocese, and Merton Priory are giving him title. Title really means a financial guarantee. You had to do this if you're going to get ordained. The ordination registers don't survive for Richard's time, but they do survive just for a generation later. And you can see that just about everybody who becomes a priest has a title, a guarantee from a monastic house. So that is the standard route. Slightly unusual, it is not a Norwich or Norfolk monastic house, and again we don't know the answer. There is nothing to explain why that should be. It is far from unique. If you look at the surviving registers, as I say, a generation later, you do see the odd monastic house from outside the diocese in them. And because he's becoming a priest in or soon after this document, which is dated 1385, saying he's about to become a priest, this gives us a reasonable guess at his age, because he would have had to be 24 to be formally become a priest. Simple mathematics, 1361, or of course earlier. So if we think roughly 1360 in Caister, we're getting as close as we're likely to get. Now his next mention in the document is 12 years later, so you get these big gaps. What was he doing, assuming he had been ordained in 1385 or 1386? He would have been a curate, an assistant priest, a chantry priest, perhaps saying masses for the dead. And though no records survive for those kind of people, so it's not unexpected, it's natural, but he doesn't appear in any record until 1397, when he is appointed to be Vicar of Sedgeford. Slide 2. Here we are. This is the institution book held at the Norfolk Record Office. This records that on a particular day, 28th of September in 1397, Master Magister Richard Caister is appointed priest at Sedgeford. Firstly, to deal with that magister, but that magister, that title, is often thought to indicate that someone was a graduate. So this is just a little tipping the evidence that he might be a graduate of Oxford or Cambridge because of that reference. But the main body of the text is saying that he's appointed vicar at Sedgeford. Sedgeford is a village 12 miles from King's Lynn, so we're talking West Norfolk. It was in the gift of the Priory of Holy Trinity, which is Norwich Cathedral. The monks and the Prior of Norwich Cathedral had the right to appoint the vicar here, as they did to many, many parishes in Norfolk and Suffolk. So they'd obviously heard of Richard, they'd come across Richard, they like what he's doing, and they think he's a fit person to be appointed to be vicar at this parish, which is one of their richest, is one of their wealthiest. Sheep raising, barley growing. How do we know that? We know because the account rolls survive. Most of the parish was owned by the priory, and they're growing these crops here and making money out of it. Richard is the vicar, so he's paid the stipends, and he probably gets also the small tithes. The village has one parish church, of which he was the vicar, St Mary's. Slide 3. This is Sedgeford Church, which in some ways will be unchanged. Of course, it has been altered, and parts of it have been altered, but the round tower will be the same. If you go inside, the font is a lovely Norman font, so it's there, but Richard would have been baptizing the children of his parishioners. Inside also are wall paintings thought to be contemporary with Richard, so these would be possibly inspiration for the sermons that he would be giving in this church. Now, Richard was vicar at Sedgeford for 5 years. Then another vacancy came up amongst the many churches held by the cathedral priory. There must have been vacancies coming up all the time, but a larger parish which had a vacancy in 1402 was St Stephen's Church in Norwich. So this is when he is appointed to Norwich and Stephen's, slide 4. And this at the top is his appointment to St Stephen's Church. St Stephen's being also in the gift of the priory. They obviously liked his work at Sedgeford, and here is his reward. It's interesting that here, however, he is titled Dominus, which is a lesser title, just means Sir. It's just a courtesy title, not Magister. So if we just saw this record without the other one, we would probably never even think that he might have been a graduate of Oxford or Cambridge. So the archives can raise problems just as much as they provide solutions. We simply don't know. Now, Norwich at that time, of course, must have been a very great change from being in the country parish of Sedgeford. It's now coming to the largest city in England outside London. Next slide. This is not, of course, a genuine archive. This is a representation of what Norwich might have looked like in that time in medieval Norwich. It's large, as I say, by medieval standards. It's not large by modern standards. People guess the population to be about 14,000. How do they do that? They look at surviving lists of names, like muster lists, taxation records, and then make some total broad guess. If there's that many taxpayers, there might be this number of people. So it's very, very inexact science in the days before census returns or recording of individual births and deaths. But nevertheless, if we think of it as being that sort of size, and the main thing about it is the importance of the religious institutions in those days. So contained within the walls, within the inner ring road, if you want a modern location for that, there's the Benedictine Priory, already mentioned at the cathedral. There's a nunnery, technically just outside the walls of Carrow. There are 4 large friaries, and there are also many parish churches. There is a well-known saying that Norwich had a church for every Sunday in the year, and in medieval times that would certainly be right. There's about 50 parishes within the city, and the one to which Richard is appointed is St Stephen's, which we know to be one of the wealthiest of the parishes. Next slide. Here we focus in on the parish of St Stephen's, not a particularly good image, but we can, for those who don't know Norwich, or some of you won't, this is immediately beside the market. The market is the heart of Norwich. The big market church of Richard's third most valuable church in Norwich is St Peter Mancroft. Just across the road, really, from there is St Stephen's. And the parish runs from there up St Stephen's Street to St Stephen's Gate, the largest gate in Norwich. In fact, this is very much Norwich's front door. This is the entrance through which kings and princes, archbishops and bishops came, coming up. This is the main road to London or to Cambridge. So these people are coming up through St Stephen's Gate and then into St Stephen's Parish and up, passing or going into Richard's Church. So it's very much an important part of Norwich. There's another church and another important religious institution just on the edge of the parish called St Mary's College, where masses were said for the souls of the great and the good of the city. So you've got these 3 big churches, because that had its own church. That is the building on which the site of the present-day Assembly House stands, on St Mary's College. And just in the front of the Assembly House was a large church, at least as large as Peter Mancroft. So you've got these 3 enormous churches, or these 3 large churches very close together. St Peter Mancroft in the market, St Stephen's just on the edge of the market, and St Mary's College. So all these places Richard must have been very much involved in. There was absolutely no documentary evidence to prove that, sadly. As well as this particular being an important part of the Norwich itself was going through big changes at the time of Richard's life as vicar. He was vicar for 18 years. And during that time, there's a lot going on in the city politically, which he've been involved in, because we know his parishioners were. This is when Norwich becomes, for the first time, a city and county in its own rights. Next slide, 7. And this is when it becomes totally independent for the first time of the Sheriff of Norfolk. Norwich has its own mayor being appointed for the first time, 1404, just 2 years after Richard was appointed, and has its own sheriffs. So it's running its own government totally now, and to celebrate that, and to provide a place for them to run the city from, they build this magnificent building still on the edge of a marketplace for Guildhall. Richard would have seen this being created. We know it was going up from 1404 onwards. Took several years, of course, to build something like this, a magnificent structure. And we know that some of his parishioners were involved in this. So wealthy people of St. Stephen's, the Brazier family, the Daniel brothers, were putting money in and being heavily involved in the building of the Guildhall. There's also a lot going on in terms of religion. Slide 8. We have seen, there was a priory, there were friaries, there were parish churches. There were also a large number, it seems to be larger for Norwich than for anywhere else. This may just be to do with the record keeping of large number of hermits, of anchorites, of small communities of women living possibly together informally. How do we know about these people? Entirely, almost entirely, by the evidence of people leaving money to them in the wills. There were hermits and anchorites in St. Stephen's parish, which have been involved with these. Marjorie Kemp met one who was actually living at the college, St. Mary's College, and he was an immigrant. She tells us that he came from abroad, we don't know from which country. And there was another anchorite actually living in St. Stephen's Gate. She was called Alice Coleman. How do I know about her? Just for that reason, that people in the parish, both laymen and assistant priests, leave money for her. So there's anchorites, as hermits, groups of people thinking about religion, and people questioning aspects of faith. Some of these, of course, are other people who are known as Lollards, and they're discussed in another talk in more detail. But Norwich people will, of course, think of Lollard's Pit when I say that, which is where, sadly, some of these people, of course, met their ends, dying for the sake of their faith. Any connections between Richard and Lollardy will be discussed in later talks, I know. The first evidence that Richard might be connected is in John Bale writing, as I say, 120 years after Richard's death, and he is the first man to say Richard he says he's a follower of Wycliffe, but secretly. You might say, if he's being secretly, how did Bale know? But that we have to leave for our own interpretation. And then Bloomfield builds on that and adds a few extra lines about that. So it's to this challenging environment that Richard arrives in 1402 and stays for 18 years. Next slide, slide 9. This is the first map of the area. This is what's known as the Sanctuary map in London, and it's dated 1541, so it's well after Richard's time, and I don't think it's particularly accurate. Certainly the shape of that church doesn't look very accurate. St. Stephen's surely has a north tower, not a west tower. But I think the housing is quite good. It gives the impression of the kind of housing which Richard's parishioners would have lived, and indeed Richard himself. We know that he lived in the parsonage, which was just beside the churchyard. So houses, large houses fronting the streets, and behind the smaller tenements where the poor lived, the poorer people lived, and those become known in Norwich as yards. So this is where Richard had his being for 18 years. During those 18 years, even in his own lifetime, he gets the phrase given to him of being the good vicar. And this phrase continues to be used at least 80 years after his death. The good vicar is a phrase specifically tied into Richard. Its first use is in Margery Kempe. So Margery Kempe, as I say, comes to Norwich. In fact, she comes particularly to hear Richard preach. But she then comes other times too and makes Richard her confessor. And she refers to him on several occasions as the good vicar. What this goodness consisted of is largely a question of interpretation of very slim pickings. There's only one document I know which actually mentions Richard during his time that he was vicar of St Stephen's for 18 years, apart from being prayer. And the one document is he happens to be mentioned in a title deed of purchase and sale of land, which incidentally does give him the magister title. So there's another 2 to 1 in favour of him being a graduate in terms of the surviving documents. But that's not very many to form a definite judgment upon. One thing these later sources stress is very much his care for the poor. And there were, of course, well, I've mentioned rich people in the parish, many poor people in the parish. There was a poorhouse just outside the city gate, what was called the Larza House, originally for lepers, but by this date for the poor. And in Richard's time, and although he's not mentioned in the document that sets it up, I can't believe he wasn't involved. And another almshouse was actually set up in the parish by the Daniel brothers, rich citizens with a social conscience, setting up an almshouse in Richard's own lifetime as vicar of St Stephen's. And that was at the other end of the parish, in fact, just at the entrance to the bus station. So out there was the almshouse. And there is the evidence of his will, we'll come to in a moment, which shows his care and concern for the poor. If he's famous for one thing, it's for preaching. As I say, Margery Kempe had a vision when she was in King's Lynn, where Jesus actually came to her and said how good Richard's preaching was, and therefore recommending her to come to all the way. Not an easy journey, perhaps not too hard for Margery, someone who'd been, or was a bit more, later went to Jerusalem and Rome, but nevertheless 45 miles to hear a sermon and 45 miles back again. It indicates that he was worth hearing, and Bale and Pitts both do pick up on that, and as of course Bloomfield picks up on what they say about that, about his preaching. He preached in English. That's an important thing to say. Of course, a lot of people are still preaching in Latin, but Richard was very much an outreach kind of person. He went out into the marketplace, according to Pitts, we believe, and preached there. So it wasn't just a question of preaching in the church. And of course, it's worth thinking about that in those days, there was a much closer link between all the parishioners and their vicar. They would have had to go to church every Sunday, in theory. They went 3 times every Sunday. And of course, for 40 or 50 holy days, when you're not working, you are expected to go to church, at least in the morning. So you're hearing plenty of church services, plenty of sermons are being heard. And of course, he's also famous as a writer, but only a minority of his parishioners would have been able to read. But next slide, slide 10. This is the metrical prayer, as I say, this will be discussed at great length in later talks. The important thing about Richard as a writer is that this is not the only thing that he wrote. Here we are totally dependent on John Bale. One of the main reasons John Bale wrote was to discover and to preserve the names of writers. He was living at a time just after the Reformation when many of these books were being burned, being destroyed, being lost. He made it his mission to preserve the names and titles of these books. He knows of about a dozen books by Richard Caister. None survive, so we've never seen them. And my personal theory is that John Bale probably hadn't seen them either. If you look at his notes, which are supplementary to his actual book, it appears that the source from which he got his information was a London bookseller's catalogue, which had a list of a dozen manuscript books, which sound from their titles as though they were sermons, so probably the same thing that he was preaching to his parishioners in St Stephen's Church. He was setting down, probably by people asking him to, into this book form. So he, like Julian of Norwich, is a very famous writer. It's interesting if you read John Bale, whose work was incredible, gathering up all these different writers' names and books. He mentions something like 30 people in Norwich, not all at once, but over the medieval period, who were writers of books. And of those, Richard is the only one who's what you might call an ordinary parish priest. All the others, without exception, are professional monks at the cathedral or friars in the various friaries. So Richard is the only person, like says 30, who is combining the daily life of a busy parish priest with being an author. So Richard works for 18 years at St. Stephen's. In March 1420, when he would have been about 60 from what we worked out about his birth date, he made his will. Next slides. His will is in Latin, as it would have to be at that date for a formal document like this. It's very short, and I think is unique. It's an odd mixture of a commonplace and a unique, really. In it, he firstly commends his soul to God, the Virgin Mary, and all the saints, which is the standard phrase you get that in almost all wills of the period, sometimes not in people who were sympathetic to the Lollard cause, but here you get the old-fashioned phrase. He asked to be buried in the chancel of St. Stephen's Church. That's natural. He's been a priest at the altar there for 18 years. So burial before the high altar would be entirely appropriate. He leaves £10, not a small sum in those days, for the provision of 2, what he calls antiphoners, service books, music service books. They would have been handwritten, so quite expensive, and presumably illuminated, to his church at St. Stephen's. And then everything else, and this is the unique bit, he leaves to the poor. And he uses this phrase, which I've not seen in any other will, where he says, according to the canons, the laws of the church, the possessions of the church are the possessions of the poor. So, of course, it's quite common for people to leave a sum of money for the poor, sometimes very generous bequests to the poor, but to leave everything to the poor on the grounds that, according to the canons of the church, the possessions of the church are the possessions of the poor, is an amazing statement, I think. And one we are very fortunate to have his will. If you're being very picky, you could say this is not his original will, because original wills don't survive. What happens is when somebody dies, the will is taken down to the court proving it, and a registered copy is made at that moment, and that is what this is here. This is original. This is a copy of the will made by the probate clerk. And the will is dated 27th of March, 1420. Now, according to John Bale, and we have no other source for this, Richard died on 29th of March 1420, 2 days later. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly natural. As I say, bearing in mind that Bale was, in his younger days, was in Norwich. It may be that there was still some commemoration of that day within the church in St. Stephen's that you know about. But anyway, he seems confident. 29th of March 1420 is the date of the death of Richard. However, and that is not the end of the story. Next slides. Richard was held in such high regard that people came on pilgrimage to his tomb in St. Stephen's to pray there. And these pilgrims, when they come, one of the things they want to do is buy a souvenir. So they buy a cheap metal badge, and this is what these are examples of pilgrims' badges relating to Richard. There's several different designs of these. They all show the same thing. They all show him standing in a pulpit, various designs of pulpit, and preaching. So this is his unique selling point. He is remembered as a preacher. The first person to come on pilgrimage is Margery Kemp, and again she talks about this in her reminiscences, is how we know. She came to the tomb of Richard, who of course was a friend of hers. She prayed there that a friend of hers in King's Lynn, a priest, be healed. He was sick, ill. She prayed for healing, and he was healed. And this is a kind of information which Pitts would pick up on, because he's, as a Roman Catholic historian, he's very keen on this idea of miraculous healings taking place. and he even suggests some took place before Richard died. We know about that from her reminiscences. We know that 60 years later, the Duke of Norfolk himself came. This is John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, 1480s. He comes, we know, because it's recorded in his household accounts. He pays visits to Norwich, visits the friary, gives them some money, visits St. Stephen's and makes a small donation, which is recorded in his accounts, so we know about that. And that is the Duke of Norfolk, who was killed in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth alongside Richard III. Other people left wills in which they asked the pilgrim to go to Richard's tomb and pray for their souls. Next slide. You get in the will registers wills like this one for John Falbeck, who's a Suffolk testator. And he's writing in Latin again, of course. This is 1450s. And asking a pilgrim to travel to St. Stephen's in Norwich and to pray at the tomb of Richard. There's half a dozen of these kind of wills, and there may well be more, because of course no one has trawled through every English will of the 15th century on the off chance of finding a mention of a particular person. So we know from by chance through various books, through people who've worked through these various wills. Mostly, as you would expect, people are coming to Richard's tomb from Norfolk and Suffolk, but they're not all. Some are coming from further afield. One is Nicholas Culpeper, who was a very important gentleman in Kent, based near Tonbridge in Kent. And he, in 1427, left an order in his will, a request in his will, that his son, not just any old person in this case, but his own son, should go to two places of pilgrimage. One is St. Thomas, Canterbury, that's to be expected, given that he was a Kent man, and the only other place of pilgrimage he wanted attended was to come to Norwich to give a duel to the shrine of Richard Gaister in St. Stephen's. So there are wills, as I say, more may well be found. One came up when I was writing this book. A gentleman who's working into Suffolk wills pointed one out to me, which wasn't known before. So there may well be more to come. Now, these wills go on for at least 3 generations. 80 years after Richard's death, he was still remembered. Next slide. We've now come to 80 years after his death. This is 1500. This will is in English. At this day, we're starting to get wills written in English rather than Latin. And this is a will of a Norwich merchant called John Stallen. And it's quite an interesting will because it has a very personal touch. He speaks about this piece of cloth, which doesn't sound like he bought it. It sounds like, in fact, he specifically says he wove it himself. He has woved, whatever the past tense of that word might be. This piece of cloth, I think he does use the word woved. Yes, he does. Like, so see it. I have woved this piece of cloth, and he wants this piece of cloth placed on this tomb in St. Stephen's Church. Whose tomb? The good vicar's grave. He doesn't even name him. He doesn't say Richard. He says the good vicar's grave, and he wants this piece of cloth woven by him personally, laying on that tomb. And as I say, that is 80 years, 3 generations after Richard has died. 1500. Final slide. And this is the church of St. Stephen's as it is today. Now, Richard wouldn't have recognised much of this because it was totally rebuilt a century after his time. But he would have recognised the tower, or at least the lower portion of the tower. If you enter through that way, if you enter through the north tower, you are passing the way Richard himself would have passed, and then on into the church itself rebuilt. And the church today maintains the same traditions that Richard might have maintained, and care for the poor, the homeless, the importance of outreach and of preaching. And there will be a talk in this series detailing the connection between Richard of the past and Richard today. So I just finish off by saying it's exactly 600 years ago that he died, 1420, and he's a figure still well worth remembering and thinking about in Norwich of today, Richard Gaister, the good vicar. Thank you.
Frank, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Really, a tour de force of how your analytical and forensic approach has been the yin to my making stuff up yang. So thank you very much for that. I've got one or two questions for you, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The first is that in Bishop John Bale's history, a number of texts are attributed to Caister, of which we only have one surviving. What are we to make of that difference?
Well, John Bale himself speaks of the destruction of manuscripts which occurred at the Reformation, at the time of dissolution of the monasteries and all that. Their libraries were simply taken out and dumped or reused for packaging books and packaging soap and things. I think he cites as an example, and he cites this particularly happening in Norwich. But as I say, I don't think that John Bale would necessarily have seen these. I think he's had access to a bookseller's catalogue in London, which lists these names of these dozen or so books, which sound their titles like they're quite short books, like they're like sermons and moral essays kind of things, rather than great long books, not the equivalent to Marjorie's Recollections or Julian's major large book. Actually, tracts, pamphlets might be words you wanted to use to explain them, but I think it's just that, just a destruction of manuscripts at the time.
Okay, thank you. The other thing is, you mentioned that he would preach in English, and associated that with the reference in Pitts, I believe it was, that he was associated with, he had Wycliffe sympathy. Just how unusual was it at the time to be preaching in English?
That's a very good question. It would be very difficult to assess, because this is where the documents are so poor. You see, we just don't have any kind of records of day-to-day services going on in churches, so we don't know. We only get hints. Some people are still publishing or having set down their sermons in Latin, but an increasing number. And of course, this is one of the things that you know better than I, Alex, that what Wycliffe is supposed to favour, isn't it? With natural, direct speech.
Yes.
Of the English would be a very interesting question. There are books about this, a chap called Aust, A-U-S-T, writes technical, learned books about the preaching, and presumably including the language of the preaching. But I think it's a sign of directness, and certainly if you go to a marketplace, as according to, I think it's Pitts that says that Richard went out to a marketplace and preached, that would be fairly meaningless. I think if you were to do that in Latin, because obviously Latin is not a natural form of speech to anybody, only the educated people are going to be familiar and understand a sermon in Latin.
Thank you. You mentioned in Richard Caister's will this remarkable phrase: "The possessions of the church are the possessions of the poor." Maybe as the priest, I should be the one who knows where that comes from more. Are you aware of a phrase like that coming up anywhere else in corresponding documents, or is that totally from left field?
I've never seen it written in any other documents. Norman Tanner, a Jesuit scholar who did a lot of work on the wills and who picks up on the will of Richard Caister, he associates it with a man, I don't even know his pronunciation, definitely, called Gratian, who wrote some sort of set canons of the church, and he thinks it's derived ultimately from that. Okay. So there is something of a textual background to it, possibly. Yes. But it's one of those things that is distinctive enough that it's sort of a almost a moment of a tangible encounter with the person's character, I suppose. You're seeing something distinctive about them. Yes, because I've looked at the wills of his executors, all of whom are priests associated with St. Stephen's, assistant priests, and also his successor and his predecessor, and none of them have anything like that at all, though some of them are making very, very generous bequests to the poor, selling houses and money going to the poor, but none are actually making that simple statement that according to canons of the church, possessions of the church are the possessions of the poor. I've never seen anything like that before. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you, Frank, so much for being willing to deliver that talk in this way. I'm afraid there is no round of applause for you,
But there may be, as the people watch this, giving their round of applause. But thank you again, Frank, for all your involvement with the Richard Caister project and for your time this evening.
That's all, Alex.